Welcome to Mex Moves, our weekly podcast on Mexico business and finance. How are you, Eduardo?
Doing well, Damien. How are you?
Good. So this week we have a couple of great interviews. We're talking to Aurelio Nuño, who was Mexico's Minister of Education from 2015 to 2017 during the Peña Nieto administration. And he, as many of you know, played a central role in the education reform, and we're going to talk to him about Mexico's educational system and its challenges it faces from the perspective of the private sector. And we also have an interview with Juan Rebolledo. Juan is the head of strategy at Lotus Education, formerly at McKinsey. Lotus is one of Mexico's leading private education groups, institutions like Universidad de Tres Culturas, Universidad Latinoamericana, and he's going to talk about opportunities that Lotus, among others, have in providing higher education to Mexico as an alternative to the cash-constrained public university system. And then we're going to talk, Eduardo and I, about GM and its announcement to expand production in the US as opposed to Mexico. A little bit of analysis behind the Heineken investment in Mexico. And we will also be talking about hard discounting in Mexico. So, Eduardo, what do you have for us this week?
Well, Damien, there was a big announcement a few days ago by General Motors deciding to invest not in Mexico, but in the United States. They are going to plunge $4 billion US dollars in plants mainly located in Michigan, Kansas, and Tennessee to boost production of about 300,000 vehicles per year, which is something that we would not necessarily be talking from a Mexican point of view. But due to the fact that Trump has put in place this 25% tariff on all imported vehicles, well, it does, this announcement show that the decisions made by companies like GM might be influenced by the tariff wars that Trump started earlier this year, and that Mexico is losing some of its charm in terms of bringing in capital to become a manufacturing powerhouse as it had been, or it still is. So that's why I bring this up in terms of the decision-making process that U.S. companies are following regarding tariffs that impact their productions elsewhere. The General Motor investment will boost production of pickup trucks, the Sierra pickup trucks and the Equinox SUV, and will hire 3,000 or between 3,000 and 4,000 new employees up north, things that could have been probably announced for Mexico if it hadn't been for what we're seeing. Obviously, the Mexican government try to put a positive spin on the announcement, as they probably correctly said that the decision to invest up north did not mean the closure of any plants here, which is good. But again, it's how you view the glass, if it's half full or half empty. And regarding the auto sector, we also had the announcement earlier this week of Michelin closing down its factory in Querétaro by the end of this year. That seems to be something more related with the old infrastructure the company had in that plant, rather than any impact of tariffs on tire producer producing in Mexico. That will probably end up costing 480 jobs, something that is painful. And that adds to the concerns that some economists are raising about job creation in the private sector over the past 5 months. There hasn't been much on that front. And the decision of Michelin to shut another plant in the country is a little bit ominous of the difficulties the economy will be facing for the rest of this year. So I don't know if you have anything to add on that front, Damien.
I think on the GM issue, there's probably multiple factors at play. in part, a cold financial decision. If you're paying tariffs on Mexican car exports to the US, obviously at the margin, it makes more sense to build those cars in the US. We still have to see how the tariffs will end up long term, post any kind of USMCA renegotiation. Secondly, there might be a political deal going on between Mary Barra, the CEO of a very high-profile CEO of GM, and Trump. She's met with Trump this year, and it's possible that Mexico got exemption on auto parts, which was a big deal for GM. So maybe there's a sort of deal whereby GM promises to invest more in car assembly, but the tariffs on car parts from Mexico go to zero because GM is very integrated with Mexico on the car part side as well. Bloomberg's also reported that Mexico and the US are nearing a deal on Mexico getting an exemption, a part exemption on steel tariffs, which is also relevant clearly for auto parts and cars. So that would be a big boon. I think there might be some kind of quota below which Mexico wouldn't pay tariffs, according to the Bloomberg story. So there might be different kind of moving parts. And then, of course, as always with these types of announcements, can't remove the possibility that it was something GM was sort of doing anyway, or something similar anyway, and they packaged it up to curry favor with Trump, but it isn't a fundamental kind of reset on what their strategy is. So it's probably a mixture of all of those things going on at the same time. Maybe there were some plans anyway to make these investments. Maybe they've made them bigger than they would have been because of the tariffs. Maybe Mary Barra wants to use this as a way of getting into Trump's good books, and maybe they got some concessions by doing it. But clearly, the trend, let's say 4 or 5 years ago, where most of the big car investments were happening in Mexico, has been reversed, and Trump is obviously going to be happy about that.
Without a doubt, yeah. On your end, what do you have, Damien?
Well, as we've got used to these days, there was another CEO or local CEO in the presidential mañanera in the morning press conference of Claudia Sheinbaum. This time it was Heineken announcing an investment of 2.75 billion from 2025 to 2028. And a new brewery will be built in Canacín in the Yucatan, which will be Heineken's 8th plant. The initial capacity will be 4 million hectoliters, and it's meant to generate 3,000 direct and indirect jobs. And it's an expansion. Heineken's not closing any of their existing plants, and it's clearly in the sort of very strategic southeast of the country, the poorest part of Mexico, where the government is very keen to generate more investment. Now, as always, a bit like the GM news, you have to kind of pass it a bit, because actually, as you may recall, Eduardo, Heineken has already announced this plant in the Yucatan. There's a press release back in late 2023. So that part of the investment isn't new. The plant itself is going to cost, when they first announced it, was going to cost about 30 to 430 million euros, 460 million US. So that's a big part of the 2.75 billion. Now it's interesting because at the same time, Constellation Brands, which is the Modelo brewer for US consumption of Modelo brands, Corona and Modelo Especial, and so on, is meant to be completing its plant in Veracruz. That's a much bigger plant. That's 25 to 30 million hectoliters. That was the plant that originally was going to be in Mexicali, and then AMLO blocked it because of lack of water, moved to Veracruz, where there's plenty of water, and it's also next to the port in Cuatza, which would enable this beer to be shipped to the US, and especially to the east coast of the US. Although even so, some of the numbers, we have limited information. We're sort of having to rely on these press releases that are often not written by the sort of investor relations or the finance arms of these companies. Supposedly, the Constellation plant for 25 to 30 million hectoliters is going to cost 1.3 billion, and that's about, in terms of capacity, about 5 times larger than the Heineken plant, but it's only costing 2 to 3 times more. So it seems as if it's going to be a much more efficient plant, maybe because it's exporting to the US. Maybe costs go down as cost per liter go down a lot as the plant gets bigger. But also, if the Heineken plant is costing, let's say, $500 million, interesting to see where the rest of that, 2.2 billion, which is a lot of money, is going. I mean, supposedly to expand the other plants, distribution centers. But my guess is, without having any kind of formal information, there's probably a little bit of padding there to go down well in the presidential press conference. And a big part of that, as I said, is actually old news back in 2023, and there's no way you can announce a plant in 2025 and it be ready within a year. So it shouldn't come as any surprise that it wasn't new.
I think the government is, if I may say so, a bit desperate to get good news on the investment side of the equation. They've been bringing in people to make these announcements, like the Heineken one, that have already been made. There's nothing really new there. Foreign direct investment didn't do bad in the first quarter, but it didn't grow. It fell from the first quarter of the previous year. And so I guess the government is trying to show a good face, while we hear on the other side that investment is drying up a little bit because of concerns on the judicial reform impact and other elements that come, tariffs and so on and so forth. So I guess they're doing their PR as much as they can. But you and I, as you said, between us, we should highlight the fact that these are not necessarily new announcements. And this is precisely the case in the Heineken new plant in Yucatan, which was first announced in September of 23, I think. Yeah. So not new news there.
Yeah, and just to be clear, probably most people know this, but Heineken in Mexico, after buying FEMSA's beer division, it owns and will produce, therefore, out of this plant and its other plants, very kind of iconic Mexican brands, not the Heineken brand per se. So Heineken in Mexico is responsible for Tecate, Indio, Sol, Bohemia, and Dos Equis, and so on. So historically, it had about 45% of market share in Mexico, and the Heineken brand itself is very small in Mexico, though growing very fast, especially the non-alcoholic version, which is my favorite.
Yeah, it's also the Constellation plant is geared for the U.S. market, while this plant is geared for the Mexican market, if I recall correctly. So they have different strategies, both companies. And then we have ABM owning Modelo for production of the other brands, the Corona, Modelo Especial brands that are sold in Mexico and exported to other markets from Mexico.
That's right. So when ABM bought Modelo under the antitrust approval, they had to give up the U.S. market, and they sold it to Constellation. So even though ABM through Modelo owns the brands, Constellation has the right to produce and sell exclusively in the U.S. So they're not allowed to sell anywhere else those particular brands, and those brands are sort of Modelo Especial, which has overtaken sort of Bud as the number one beer in the US. Corona, most famously, I guess, here in Mexico. Pacifico, Victoria Negra, Modelo are their brands. So they sort of divide up the market with Heineken, and both of those plants, the Constellation plant, the one in Veracruz, has also been has been significantly delayed beyond the Mexicali delay, which was imposed on them by AMLO. If you listen to their earnings calls, they're sort of, they're always, it seems to be they're permanently sort of about to inaugurate this plant. I think they're now looking at the end of this year, maybe next year, before it comes on stream. And then while on the subject of Mexican brands and the Mexican market in the US, there's a great story, a sad story, but a great story from a journalistic perspective in the Wall Street Journal about how US consumer companies are being negatively affected by the immigration raids and the general climate of fear that exists in many Hispanic communities in the US. I don't know if you had a chance to read the story, but it talks about how Coca-Cola is suffering, its sales are suffering from Hispanics and especially Mexican Americans, either staying at home and therefore not consuming as much or not risking going to work on construction sites or in restaurants and therefore having less income and therefore less money to spend. And Coca-Cola had a 3% drop in North American sales in first quarter, and that was attributed to a pullback by Latino consumers. And both Modelo and Corona, Constellation marquee brands in the US, also had weak numbers, and partly blamed on this crackdown on undocumented migration and the riots. Obviously, now probably going to make the situation much worse. And the New York Times in Dealbook also talks about the issue of it now becoming increasingly difficult to find workers in the restaurant industry, in the agricultural sector, in the construction sector, and that also going to be affecting, or analysts are at least concerned that that's going to start affecting the capacity of many US companies to meet their production targets or their service targets. And the riots over the weekend and the sort of the diplomatic row between Mexico and the US is all going to exacerbate that, I would think.
No doubt about it. I mean, the Wall Street Journal did a story a few months ago already telling us that the migrant communities were being very cautious going outside, keeping themselves at homes. I guess that was when Trump hadn't yet started this raid move that has inflated sentiments in LA and in other parts of America. It is quite worrying. I mean, the U.S. is not in a very solid footing, and migrant communities are important in the spending world of America. So it's going to be interesting to see how far this goes in terms of growth in America. And obviously that will impact Mexico as well in the rebound, as we know that the two economies are very well integrated. So what I read a few months ago was the beginning of that concerns, which I think then declined because nothing really happened until this weekend when apparently Stephen Miller at the White House gave the order to crack down on undocumented workers, and flares started flying, unfortunately. And we're seeing the consequences over the past few days. So, yeah, it's another thorn in the U.S. economy that Trump has brought up upon itself, from my point of view.
Two other snippets, Eduardo, that caught my attention this week. We've talked a bit in the past about Arca Continental, which is the second largest Coca-Cola bottler in Latin America after Coca-Cola FEMSA, and it's expanding again into the US. It's signed an agreement to acquire Imperial, a US-based operator of vending machines and micro markets across Oklahoma, Texas, and Arkansas. It specializes in automated food and beverage distribution, which is quite a high margin business. And as you know, Arca is already present in Texas via its bottling operations that it acquired there. So it's doubling down on the southern sort of US corridor and moving into the sort of more digitalized convenience food and beverage sales. So it builds up its presence. It might be slightly defensive. Vending machines could insulate Arca from sort of grocery price wars, and it gives it more direct access to consumers as it's not being intermediated by stores. So we'll see where this goes. It's obviously just a small part of the US, more room for it to continue expanding if it so wishes.
No, I'm glad you brought it up. So we have a more positive outlook on things going on between the two countries and between their corporate worlds.
And another big Mexican company with sizable operations in Florida, Grupo Mexico Transportes, the railway division of Grupo Mexico, just proposed to delist from the Mexican Stock Exchange just 7 years after its IPO, which really was the last big local IPO out of Mexico. There have been a few very small ones, but this was the last big one. So obviously for people focused on the Mexican stock market. This is disappointing. Back in 2017, it raised $1 billion in its then IPO. The IPO was at 31 pesos 50, and it's now about 35 pesos. So it's had a very small gain, less than the gain you would have got from buying Mexican bonds over that time. But the company has done quite well, and it's grown its profits a lot. And so the EBITDA multiple, the valuation multiple, back then was sort of 12 times when they did the IPO, which is probably why they did it. And now it's, gone down to 8 times. It's got quite a small free float. So it's only going to, if this goes through, it's only going to cost about $600 million to buy out minority shareholders. But you also have Carlos Slim as a big minority shareholder. So my guess is that now that it's going to be a private company, the Grupo Mexico, which has a huge amount of cash on its balance sheet, the parent company, due to its copper businesses, may simultaneously seek to buy out Slim if they can reach a price, although not easy for Mr. Larrea and Mr. Slim to agree on a fair price to buy and sell an asset.
Yeah, that'll be an interesting discussion, I gather.
Yeah, but they have to make it available to them, as I understand the securities law. So if they do the offer, everyone has the option to sell. But I guess you can't force them to sell. But then they'll end up owning a minority stake in a private company. And then there was another relatively small, but I thought quite interesting news, which was that a Russian company called Mir is looking to move into Mexico and in the hard discounting sector, basically low margin products, many private label, and competing with Tiendas 3B, which did a very successful IPO a year ago. According to a brokerage report, Mir is just planning to open 5 stores this year, but planning to have 50 stores over the next 2 years. Now, 3B has 2,900 stores, so it's very, very small. Mir, which is Russian, has had challenges in Europe because of sanctions and interruption of its supply chains, but their prices are often apparently 30% lower than Aldi and Lidl, the two sort of dominant hard discounters there. So one assumes is going to come into Mexico with a very sort of no frills, low cost approach, and maybe they're coming to Mexico because of the challenges that they've faced in Europe.
Interesting. Yeah, that seems a sector that it's attracting all different types of players. With 3B probably be the leader at the moment.
Yeah, I mean they're small. I mean Mir, if I'm pronouncing it right, their own the Russian parent is called Sever-to-4. If they get to these 50 stores, just to compare that, 3B is opening 500 or so stores a year. So it's a tiny amount even of incremental stores. Barra, which is FEMSA's hard discount format, has 360 stores or so, and then Neta, which is the sort of Grupo Salinas hard discounting one, has about 1,700 stores. So it's going to be a small player, but maybe they're have ambitions later on. My guess is if it has any effect, it will encourage 3B and Neto and Barra, and then, though it's not exactly a hard discounter, Bodega Aurora Express, it sort of competes to some extent with the same type of customer, will accelerate their openings to not leave any space on the any money on the table for a new player.
It's interesting. Also, is that a sign that the Mexican consumer is also struggling, Damien, and that discount stores are the way to go?
Well, I think it's partly that. As you will have seen, 3B reported excellent same-store sales in the first quarter, whereas the traditional retailers didn't. And one explanation of that is that in more difficult times, consumers are more attracted to a bargain. So I think there is an important kind of element of that.
Yeah. Okay. So shall we move on to our 2 great interviews for this week, Damien?
Yeah, that makes sense. This week, we're joined by Aurelio Nuño Mayer, one of the key figures behind Mexico's 2013-2017 education reform. He served as Mexico's Minister of Education, and earlier he was Chief of Staff to the then President Peña Nieto. Since leaving office, Aurelio has been very active in education. From 2020 to 2022, he was a visiting professor at Harvard's Graduate School of Education, and he was also a visiting scholar at the Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He's here with us today to talk about Mexico's educational system, how it's evolving, and what still needs to be done. Aurelio, thank you very much for joining us today.
No, thank you. Thank you, Damien. Thank you, Eduardo. It's a pleasure to be with you and being in your podcast.
Aurelio, why don't we just kick off by asking you a little bit what you've been up to in the educational arena since leaving government back in 2018?
Well, centrally, I've been doing two things. As you mentioned, I spent 4 years at Harvard, first as a visiting scholar at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I was teaching a seminar on the comparative politics of education. I'm writing a book about it because I did a lot of research on Mexico, but also comparing Mexico with several other countries around the world, including the US and the UK, for instance, and Latin American countries. I've been doing research, in one way, and in the other aspect, 5 years ago, I also co-founded a startup on technology and education. And centrally, what we do at that startup is that we create an online model of education, trying to have all the advantages of online education, but improving the the education part of online education, because centrally you have a big problem with online education, which is basically no one is able, or just a small percentage of people is able to finish courses. And we create a new model, including tutoring and many other aspects, and the model has been successful. So centrally, I've been doing those two things.
Brilliant. So, Aurelio, before we get into the causes of Mexico's educational weaknesses, why don't we start off with a diagnosis of the situation from your perspective? How good a job is Mexico doing in preparing young people for the labor market of today? Are we equipping Mexicans with the right skills?
No, unfortunately, no. Actually, I think currently Mexico, like many other countries, actually, including the US, for instance, Mexico is under a huge education crisis. And let me just one example about that. According with the PISA exam, this exam that the OECD have in around 60 countries around the world. According with the last PISA exam, Mexican students, this is students around 15 years old, Mexican students, only 1% of Mexican students are able to distinguish between a fact and opinion. So basically, they cannot understand a text. To put it comparatively, in the US, which from my point of view, it is also under a crisis, 8% of students can distinguish between a fact and opinion. It's very low, but it's 8 times higher than in Mexico. In the UK, which is not extremely good, but it's around 15%. So, unfortunately, the quality of education in Mexico is very, very poor. That's why we did an educational reform, but unfortunately, the Morena government reversed the reform. But centrally, what I can tell you is Mexico has done a quite good job historically in terms of creating a huge educational system. The coverage of education in Mexico is very good in terms of the development of the country. Nonetheless, the quality is extremely low. So unfortunately, no. And especially under the technological change that we are living currently, the educational system in Mexico is it's not equipping, unfortunately, our students to face this new reality.
You think the causes are exclusively political, that Morena wants the support of the teachers' union, and the teachers' union
wants to block educational reform because from its perspective, it's against accountability? Or do you think it's way more complex than that?
Well, centrally, the key problem is a political problem. It's not a problem of policy, it's a problem of politics. The key problem is that unions leaders in Mexico has controlled the professional career of teachers. So, for instance, union leaders are able to control the promotions of teachers, the salaries of teachers, and they use that power in a clientelistic fashion. So, for instance, if a teacher wants to be considered for a promotion, they have to do political work for the union. In Mexico, we have two unions. The bigger one normally force teachers to mobilize for elections, and they are very effective. And historically, they have had alliances with different parties. At the beginning, it was with the PRI, when the PRI was an hegemonic party. Then when the PAN won the election in the 2000, they made an alliance with them, and now they have an alliance with Morena. We were able actually to do the educational reform because President Peña Nieto was the first and the only president until now to win an election without political agreement with the union. So the union was not part of our governmental coalition. And basically that's the reason why we were able to do a very aggressive educational reform. But now they are part of the Morena's coalition. Well, the other union, the CENTE with C, it is now part of the coalition of Morena, although they are having troubles now, but at the end of the day, they are part of the political coalition of Morena. And they use that power for mobilizing teachers for elections, but also for protest. And for instance, they have a rule that disappeared when we did the reform, but unfortunately, they now are enforcing again that rule. And the rule is that if a teacher wants to be considered for a promotion, they have to have an 80% of assistance, not to their classrooms, but to the protest or the political work of the union. So this problem has created that, unfortunately, teachers cannot have a good professional development. And teachers are the key element for a quality of education. So centrally, I'm simplifying with this explanation, but centrally, this political problem has been the main challenge for changing the quality of education. Actually, we did a reform. We were able to change that, but unfortunately, Morena reestablished the old status quo and they established all the power of leaders, and we are now more or less exactly in the same position as we were 10 years ago, unfortunately.
Aurelio, and in that sense, and following what you just told us, which is very dramatically sad, we hear that parents are moving their kids to the private sector because the quality of education, as you just told us, is unfortunately very bad. Is that true from your perspective, and is that putting any pressure on the union or the teachers, the core elements of the union, to make change or look for change? I guess if you're a teacher and you're dedicated to your kids, you want those barriers for your career upbringing to be lifted or eliminated. But I don't know if there is an internal struggle within the union. But we hear that parents are moving teachers from the public to the private sector.
That's right. Unfortunately, not many Mexican families have the purchase power to pay a private school. In some places, especially where the union is more powerful, like in southern Mexico, you have a boom of very cheap private schools, but they are also very poor in terms of quality. Probably a little bit better than public schools, but not too much. So unfortunately, moving kids to private schools is not a real option. And one of the problems with education, not only in Mexico, but globally, is education, especially if you compare education, for instance, with health services or security services. In the case of education, you don't have immediate results, and the results of education are not as clear as they are in health, for instance. In the case of health, if the government can provide vaccines or not is very evident. If doctors can provide quality health is very evident. The same with security. But it's not the same on education. Centrally, education is a black box, centrally for parents. Therefore, although education in the long run is extremely important, super important, and obviously everyone understands that, it's very difficult to be aware that during the first years of education, during primary school, which is absolutely key, if you don't learn the basics during primary education, is very difficult to learn afterwards. And this is a biological problem with the brain. When you are a young kid, you have a more, your brain is more able to learn. The best way to understand this is, for instance, the ability that small kids have to learn a second language. Well, basically, this is with all knowledge. So if you don't have good teachers on primary school, it's very difficult to improve education. So, but it is also very difficult for parents during primary school to be totally aware that their kids are not learning what they should learn. And this black box, it plays in favor of these clientelistic powers, because centrally, you don't have parents organizing, claiming for better education, not only in Mexico, but around the world. It's not very common because you have this problem of the black box. And also, parents have a problem of collective action. Centrally, parents, they have to work, especially if their income is not very high, they have to work very far, and it's very difficult for them to organize. But all those things play against an education quality in political terms, and it plays in favor of these clientelistic powers, which centrally had been extremely difficult to change. I mean, Mexican governments have been aware of this problem since a long time ago, centrally since the 1960s, and especially in the 70s and in the 80s. Mexican governments were aware of the problem of the union power and the relationship between the union power and the quality of education, and they have tried to solve the problem, but they couldn't, centrally because of the political power. We were close to solve the problem with the reform, which was an exception, centrally because the unions were not part of our coalition government, not for educational reasons, but for political reasons. But we take the opportunity, we did the reform, but the next government reversed it, centrally for a political problem. So basically, yeah, that's the creep problem, and it's a huge problem because for the reasons I was explaining, for parents, it's very difficult to challenge that problem as well.
You mentioned at the beginning that you're a co-founder of a technology company. How is technology, or do you view technology as a tool? It's very impressive to me that we have all these tools where we can take classes online or listen to very intelligent people on our home and our computers. And yet, most people, well, I'm maybe exaggerating, but reading comprehension, like you said, it's really down in percentage levels of the population. Is there anything technology can help us with, or what do you view from that point of view?
Well, yes and no. What is very clear is that especially during the first years of life, so in all the primary years of education, teachers are absolutely central. You cannot substitute teachers with technology. And but this is, I mean, many people for many years had thought that technology magically improved education and that kids probably could not longer need a teacher. And that's not true. All kids need a good teacher. Of course, technology, especially AI, can help teachers to improve the way they teach. And especially you can have AI agents which could help and coach students as complementary tutors. But at least not yet, technology can substitute teachers. And that's very evident. As I was explaining, online education, I don't know, 20 years ago or a decade ago, many people thought that online education could be the solution for this problem of education quality, which, by the way, in Mexico, it's very serious. But as I was explaining, the problem is present in many other countries, centrally in the US, for instance. And the problem in the US is very similar to Mexico, and it is related with the power of unions there. But at the end of the day, they thought that online education and digital technology could help to solve this problem, and have not happened. Centrally, because teachers continue to be central to the process of education. So, in conclusion, I would say we need teachers, we need good teachers, and teachers could be complemented, but not substitute by good technology. You have to know which kind of technology. You have to be very savvy in order to select the good technology. And especially, I think AI can improve that, but AI cannot substitute teachers, not now at least. No?
Aurelio, Mexico has very high levels of income inequality and also very low levels of social mobility. People who born to poor families tend to stay poor. And if you look at the companies listed in the stock market, the vast majority of the CEOs, CFOs, and so on were educated in the private system. What can the private sector do, given the state of public education, to try and ameliorate and soften those realities that Mexico faces?
I don't know. It's difficult. I mean, they can do some efforts, and actually some of them, some part of the private sector has historically tried to help and solve this problem. But to be honest, the impact of the private sector is minimal. In Mexico, nationally, 95% of students go to public schools, centrally at primary level, then at university change. But so it's very difficult. Centrally, to be honest, I think they cannot really change this problem. This problem has to be solved in the public arena, and it has to be solved in politics and in political terms. It's very difficult that the private sector can make a significant change on this problem.
Can the teachers in public schools be your allies in changing things if you were in government?
Yes, actually, they were allies of the educational reform because centrally, as you mentioned before, obviously they don't want to be tied to these clientelistic power structures. No, they want to develop their profession autonomously and freely. When I was Minister of Education, every morning I was in a school. I traveled all around Mexico, and I really knew teachers, and the majority of them, they have a full commitment with education. And centrally, they want to get rid of this arbitrary power, which centrally is stopping them for develop their abilities and is stopping them to, which they centrally love to do. And they don't want to live like that. I mean, centrally, when you depend on an arbitrary power, like they depend on those leaders, you are not free, and they are not exercising their profession freely. So they want to get rid of that. But it's very difficult because they have as well a problem of collective action. And when government starts a reform like that, they ally with the government. At the beginning, they have doubts because, we introduce evaluations, no? We get rid of leaders, but we implement evaluations in order to create a civil service for teachers. So at the beginning, they were a little bit scared about evaluations. But at the end of the day, after some years of the reform was implemented, they realized that it was much better to prepare exams and to be studying and to create a professional career on their performance than depend on the arbitrary power of union leaders. So centrally, yes, there were allies of the reform, but unfortunately, the reform was in place only 6 years. And then the reform was reversed, and the power of union leaders, it's huge. And it's an arbitrary power. So centrally, they fear union leaders. For instance, when we were implemented the reform, maybe you might recall this, when we were implementing the reform in some states of southern Mexico, especially in Oaxaca and in Chiapas, union leaders, for instance, basically repressed or they were very aggressive against teachers which were participating in the evaluations and want to change the system. Actually, they exercise violence against those teachers. So this is a serious thing. But yes, centrally, they prefer a reform and they could be your allies, but it's a huge and deep problem. Huh?
Aurelio, we've heard from different people on this podcast that Mexico has a big pool of, relatively talented, trained people. We heard from Mi Salud that there are lots of, qualified, quality Mexican doctors that can be used remotely to attend to Mexican Americans. We've heard from another tech engineer. Wiseline has hired tens of thousands of engineers, Guadalajara, Querétaro, other places to serve U.S. companies. Companies like Bombardier or GM, Stellantis, have talked about how Mexico every year produces 160,000, 4 times more than Germany annual basis. How do you square those comments from businessmen that there's this kind of pool of talented labor in Mexico with the crisis in the educational system reflected by the very low PISA scores and other evidence?
Well, centrally because it's a minority. I mean, the numbers might sound very high, but at the end of the day, you are talking about a minority of the population. So centrally, I think that the main challenge for development in Mexico, not only for justice, but also for economic growth, it's the quality of education. If we were able to change that, we could have 10 times more quality engineers than we have now. And that could dramatically change Mexico. So, of course, we have, like many other countries, we have a good pool of talent, and we have very talented engineers, doctors, and so on and so forth. But if you look at them, I mean, Mexico is a huge country. So, yes, it's 4 times that. I think that figure it's a little bit exaggerated, but yeah, we have more engineers than Germany, but we're a huge country and we could have much more. China, for instance, China has been extremely successful on education. China is number 1 in all PISA scores, and it depends on the area. China is huge. But now you can see the results. I mean, it's absolutely impressive, the number of engineers with a very good quality that you can find in China. I mean, you can find much more, not only because they are more, but also in per capita terms, you can find much more good engineers in China than in the US. So if Mexico could change this problem of the quality of education, I mean, we don't have the China size, we could dramatically change the conditions for economic growth, development, and justice in the country. So that's why. I mean, it's a problem of scale. I mean, Mexico has a reasonably good educational system for minorities. But the problem is how we can change that and in terms of increase that quality for the majority of the population.
Aurelio, in that sense, I mean, you've painted quite a bleak picture, which is based on facts. Do you see any light at the end of the tunnel? What's your forecast for our education levels in Mexico?
No, unfortunately, I'm very pessimistic, at least for the next years, because the political problem, as I have described, is very deep and it's very difficult to solve. And education takes time. So even if the current government, which obviously is not going to do it because unions are part of their political coalition, but even if for some magical reason the current government decides to do an educational reform, it's going to be tough. It's going to be difficult, but it will take time, no? At least 10 years, I mean, a couple of decades probably. So I'm pessimistic, but not totally. I still thinking that, especially if we continue to talk about these issues, which normally are not in the front pages of newspapers. I mean, it's not a public discussion here in Mexico as it should be. So centrally, I'm optimistic that if we continue to talk about this issue and we show light on this problem and we discuss it more, I hope that in the near future, we were able to do a reform again and keep working on this situation. Right?
Well, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the podcast. Good luck with the startup, and hope to have you back on the program before long.
Yeah, no, thank you. It was a pleasure. And whenever you want, we can continue discussing about education and other things if you want. But yeah, it has been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aurelio. I'm glad we bring these issues up to the forefront a little bit more. Like you said, there needs to be more discussion about this in Mexico for its future, without a doubt.
Definitely. Thank you.
Dr. Juan Rebolledo. Juan joined Lotus Education beginning of this year as the Chief Strategy Officer, and he's helping steer one of Mexico's largest and fastest growing higher education platforms in that capacity. Before Lotus, Juan was a consultant at McKinsey and Company, advising organizations, including educational organizations and the public sector across Latin America on planning, operations, organizational design. Before that, he worked in the finance ministry, and he has a PhD from Yale, where he was also a postdoctoral fellow. Juan, thank you for joining today.
Thank you very much, Damon and Eduardo. And it's a real pleasure and an honor to be here with you both.
So, Juan, tell us a little bit what drew you to Lotus Education from McKinsey, obviously one of the top firms in the world, and how do you see Lotus's role evolving in the current Mexican educational landscape?
Well, I think a common thread of my career, what has always driven me, moved me, has been social impact. As you were mentioning it, I've been able to do it from the private sector, from the public sector. And, McKinsey is a great place to have social impact. And I was very lucky to work with a lot of very high impact clients from private and public sector. But the more I talked to people, the more I got a sense of the challenges that Latin America was facing. It always came back to education and how that is a key constraint in eliminating poverty, in really advancing economic development in the region. And when I was approached and began conversations with Lotus, I saw a great opportunity given a great need, right? So I think that the important context to know about Mexico in particular, where Lotus is currently located, is we have a very low rate of graduates from undergraduate degrees, right? So it's around 43%, which is way below the Latin American average of 51%. You have Colombia at 55, Costa Rica like around 55, Argentina and Chile significantly higher in the 70s. And access remains a big challenge in this country, right? So if you look at the 2023-24 cycle, there were 1.7 million applications to public universities, and they only accepted about 800,000 people, right? That's like a 54% rejection rate. So when education being such a critical component of sort of poverty alleviation, if there's like studies from IADB that say that in Mexico, the estimate is around the hourly wage would be twice as high, right? If you have an undergraduate degree as if you didn't. So the combination of this challenge, right? Like how can we think about generating opportunities at an affordable price for people that can really help them change their lifetime earnings? That was what really drew me to this amazing story of success that is Lotus, that is now entering a second phase of even more accelerated growth. So I think the challenge of running a well-run business while having high social impact was what really drew me to Lotus.
Some of our listeners may not be that familiar with Lotus. Why don't you just run through some key stats and key milestones in its history?
Sure. I think I would talk about Lotus as having had three big stages, and we're starting the third stage, right? So you have the first stage when Lotus started as a search fund and identified and bought Universidad de las Tres Culturas, UTC, in Zona Rosa in la Ciudad de México, that had around 6,000 students. Over the next 2.5 years, they really focused on making it more efficient, increasing the margins, and also increasing students by opening new campuses and by increasing students in existing campuses. They were able to go from around 6,000 students to like 8,000 students. So it's really impressive growth in a very short amount of time because this was a clearly underserved market, right? We were offering a good alternative, a quality alternative at a very affordable price for many of our students were people who got rejected from these public universities, who applied in Mexico City, who applied to UNAM, where about 9 out of 10 people get rejected. And then once they didn't have that as an option, they were still looking to get a higher education degree of good quality, and they joined Universidad de las Culturas. At that point, you start what I would call phase two, which is leadership at Lotus realized that this was a systemic problem across the country and not only localized in this small area, and that there were a lot of efficiencies to be had by professionalizing the sector. And that's when they entered this stage of serial acquisition. So over the next 5-6 years, they acquired 5 brands, right? So basically about a brand a year. So they acquired Universidad Latinoamericana, also in the state of Mexico and parts of Mexico City, UTEG, in Universidad Tecnológica de Guadalajara, which is in the West Coast, and WANE, which is in the Northeast. And over those 5 years, we went from the 8,000 to 90,000 students, right? So it's a huge ramp up. So you get a sense. It took Tec de Monterrey, which is one of the largest private education systems in Mexico, 50 years to get to 90,000 students. And at Lotus, they did that in around 6 years. And partly believing also in the ability that scale was key, that we needed to have scale to really be able to offer quality education at an affordable price, like to really disrupt and offer something that has not been offered before in Mexico. Now we're entering stage 3. We've got scale. 90,000 is something that it's meaningful, right? We should be able, and we are starting to deliver on the progress of scale. And now we are entering this third stage that's combining both. We're still going to be looking at inorganic options, but how do we grow organically? How do we deliver as an educational platform and really get that sort of the benefits from having achieved scale? This started last year, right? I joined, and over the course, if you look at sort of the top management over the last 6 months, you see that half of us have joined over the last 6 months for this new phase of Lotus growth.
And Juan, is this scale that you're looking for grounded on technical infrastructure or physical infrastructure, like more universities, more campuses? What's the proposition that Lotus brings to the educational industry?
So I think there's several things that scales gives us, right? That if we think about the phrase quality education at affordable prices, if we separate it, I think we know how to do high quality education, right? So several private universities in Mexico that are non-for-profit are really high quality. UNAM is high quality, but they cost a lot to operate, right? The price is very high in the private ones and in the public ones. Even though the price might be zero, the cost is very high, right? And we also have universities that might be very low cost, but they have trouble being able to offer high quality because quality requires investments. So what we are doing, our proposition is we can do this investment centralized that makes sense because we have scale that can help us increase the quality, make us more efficient, and maintain an affordable price, right? So to give you some examples, some of our technology, right? Some of our student information systems, for example, these are ones used by top universities around the world. And they would not make sense for a university that has 4,000 students, right? At the price that we charge. But it makes sense if we're doing it for 90,000 students. It makes more sense if we're doing it for 200,000 students, right? So there's something on the technology side for sure. There's also a part in which if we do centralized, which we're doing centralized back office really well, we can unburden campuses, academic directors, campus directors from the administrative burden so that they can focus on the student, on education, on the journey, which is the most important part of the product.
So basically, yes, you're using technology to be a low-cost education platform, but you have physical presence to have the high quality needed for the formation and preparation of students at the university level. Did I get that right?
Yeah. We think ourselves also as an education platform, right? So we make sure that both our in-person as our online students, which are becoming one of our fastest increasing modalities, all get access to the same technological platform. For students, they only see one thing, which is their virtual campus. But the virtual campus, which is proprietary, is actually pulling from all these other technological platform that we've adapted. Some is proprietary, some are the best players in the industry, but customized to our particular population.
Correct. And so what's the percentage of students remotely being educated and the ones that go to campuses?
So right now, ballpark numbers, if we're around 90,000 students, you have around 35,000 students that are online, right? So we have a significant amount that's coming from online, and it's growing at a fast pace because of the flexibility. We are a little bit ahead of maybe the trend in education in Mexico, but this is common to Mexico and Latin America, right? Post-COVID, we just saw this really accelerate, and the demand for regulated online programs and unregulated, but especially in regulated, has been increasing significantly.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if COVID had any impact, the pandemic itself, on the way the model evolved.
Oh, for sure, right? I think definitely made us need to make investments in being able to operate everything remotely. We were ahead of the curve because we were already thinking of going this way even before this, but we were not exactly where we needed to be. And this helped us accelerate to be able to offer to our students what needed to be offered. But I think it was a proof of concept for a lot of people who might not have considered online before. They considered it during COVID, and it worked for many people, right? The flexibility that it offers. So what we see now, if you look at student preferences for undergraduate degrees, you still have that in their first semesters, they prefer to be in person. But the closer they get into graduation, the more they're looking to have flexibility and be able to take some courses online. And our population, more than others, many of our students already have a job from the start of their undergraduate degree at 18, 19 years of age. So they value that flexibility even more, right? So,
Juan, what about quality? Mexico, like a lot of people like to say that Mexico produces more engineers than Germany. I'm imagining that the quality on average isn't as high as Germany. How would you describe overall the quality of university education in Mexico? How would you categorize statements like Mexico has more engineers than Germany, and where does Lotus fit in that?
I think Mexico at the elite universities, public and private, can compete with any university in the world. But unfortunately, that you don't have mass access to that, right? That is the big question mark, right? If you look at the average low-cost university, there are challenges to quality. As I was mentioning to Eduardo before, if you have these small university, just mom and pop, sometimes it's very hard to make the necessary investments on curriculum, and even the larger universities, right? So one of the largest public universities in Mexico, their economic syllabus, for example, it was last updated in 1994, right? So one of the biggest challenges that education sector has in Mexico universities, and why this statement around the engineers and the number of engineers and the quality of engineers, is that we make these big investments at some stages or some moments, particular moments in education, and then nothing happens for decades, right? That's where I think Lotus makes a difference, right? The other element, before I tell you how Lotus makes it different, is there's a broken link between the productive sector needs and the skill formation in engineers, for example, right? So obviously you need very important technical skills, but even what we're seeing, like if you look at the World Economic Forum report of earlier this year, right? That 70% of employers were saying that soft skills is really where the problem lies, or where the skill that they see lacking. And you look at the programs and the curriculums that our universities are offering in Mexico, and they don't have that part. We are trying to solve these two things, right? So, for example, 74% of our curriculums were updated in 2023. We're constantly thinking, how can we move much faster, because we're doing this work centrally to make sure we're up to date. Or on the soft skills, we have an educational model that has 30% courses that everyone, no matter what degree you're taking, you need to study. And they are not focused on like sort of general knowledge on history or something like that, which is also very valuable, but we've decided to focus on soft skills and how do we generate and support them on, or some specific hard skills, like think about Excel, think about PowerPoint use, that sometimes you have graduates that don't know how to use it. And in the end, I think this all translates into this big differentiation in lack of affordability between these premium schools and the rest, except for us that are affordable and do offer high quality. So one of the premier private schools in Mexico, so you get a sense of sort of magnitude, the whole degree is around $80,000. A degree with us in Tres Culturas The whole degree is around $3,500, right? So it's a huge difference, right? And we are trying to, and because we're trying to see how can we get the best pedagogical knowledge, the best technical knowledge, make some central investments that allow us to diffuse this throughout our organization.
So how are Mexican engineers compared to German ones?
I think some of the best Mexican engineers are better than the German engineers, but I think we still have a long way to do to raise the quality of our median engineer.
Juan, a key element in education is the tutor, the professor. How do you deal with making sure that you hire high quality professors, or how do you keep them updated? As you just mentioned that you update your programs, educators need to be updated as well. What's the Lotus way of doing things in that front?
I completely agree, right? The professor is one of the things that move the needle the most in terms of the impact you can have, right? So what we do is first we need to work clearly on the hiring part of the professors. How do we get the right professors? And sometimes if we are able to centralize a lot of the quality material, the quality program, what we need them to have is great pedagogical skills, right? Which we can train on, to build on, so that they can leverage the content that we can make available for them, so that the student actually acquires top quality knowledge, right? We need to we have these development programs for them, right? Which again comes from scale. So can we offer right now, maybe a small mom and pop university in front of one of our campuses can offer a slightly higher wage than we can, but they're probably, that's it in their trajectory. Whereas us that have 4,000 professors, that we have many campuses, you can think of several career paths in which one professor can then move to a different brand that's a little bit better, or they can migrate to become the campus director, or they can come centrally to Lotus because we have all these positions. So by aligning incentives for them to want to keep up to date and us being able to provide that centrally, we generate a lot of asynchronic capability building programs matched with some specific mentoring between senior professors and junior professors that have proven to be successful.
What about the role of AI in education? Obviously, this is a topic of the year and the few coming years.
Yes, so I think we are thinking about AI strategically through three different lenses, right? So one is, how can we use AI to strengthen the productivity of our people in the different functions that they're sort of working in, right? So AI in procurement, AI in our contact center, AI. The second one is, how do we generate a culture within our colleagues of using AI to innovate? And the third one is, because of what you said, how do we prepare our students to be able to use AI? Our professors, how do we get them to use AI and use AI ethically and be prepared for the challenge, preparing our students for the challenges of the workforce? On this last one, right? So I think it's also an example of what we sort of bring as a disruptor, right? So last year, we said AI is a critical aspect of what's happening and our students need to know it. And we launched in 3 months and, partnering with a global education leader to offer a program for all 90,000 of our students. So all 90,000 of our students got this program to learn how to create prompts, to learn about AI. We're going to keep improving on it, but we were able to do that in months. Some universities, it takes them years to be able to change their curriculum. On the second front, which is the culture of AI, the first thing is to have clear policies and allow them to innovate, right? We've generated some guidelines for people to start taking risks, controlled risks within our environment, and generating special squads to prove to the rest of the organization the impact it can have. And on the first one, we are, every day we are talking to those leaders in the industry out there, generating these AI enhancements and analyzing the use cases, focusing on ROI, because I am sure that AI is going to bring a lot of use cases with ROI. But right now, there's not that many out there clearly identified, right? So I think it's important for us to make the right bets.
And finally, from my side, Juan, you've joined the company recently. You're on the strategic front. What are you bringing, or what are your challenges as you join the company?
So we've been working on the strategic plan 2025-2029. We're actually making it public within the organization over the next few weeks. It's ready to be presented. I mean, it's very ambitious. It's about, more than doubling our size in the next 5 years at a different part of the curve, right? We are working across 30 strategic initiatives in play that give us sort of not only the right to play, but the right to win, right? So what geographies should we be in? What programs should we be offering? How do we really leverage our scale to offer the quality? Because I think there's a lot of very impressive things that Lotus has done to get to the point in which we have 90,000 students. Now is the time to really capitalize on having scale. And how do we use scale to empower the student? That's in the end what we need to do. Scale to empower the student.
Will you be, Juan, will you be moving to more elite education, complementing your existing offering, or will you stay very much in the market where you are now?
Current intentional part of our strategic plan is we think there's an underserved population in the area where we are, and there's a lot of opportunities still, and there's a lot of people who still can't have access to low, affordable, quality education. So our plan for the near future is definitely to stay within that segment. We think focus is critical at this stage.
Some people say that in Mexico, the returns from higher education are lower than elsewhere because companies hire who they know and not what people know. Do you think there's a sufficiently meritocratic culture in the Mexican private sector to create the right incentives for people to get a university education?
It definitely, we should all as a society keep working to create a more meritocratic process of hiring and across all sectors. I think it's more of a pronounced problem for elite universities than it is for our graduates. I mean, I think there's an undeniable aspect of networking and even a skill that we need to be preparing our students for, right? But what we do see is as Mexico keeps developing, as more multinationals locate themselves in Mexico, they are more clearly making, as a lot of our Mexican companies are professionalizing themselves or becoming public and entering other markets, they are looking for qualified talent, right? They are looking for specific skills. We have conversations with employers all the time. Like we have corporate university that we offer sort of these universities that they can think about the skill formation at their place of work. And my interaction with them, our interaction with them has always been that they are looking to identify the right talent that diminishes the turnover that they have, right? The big problem in Mexico is that they have, not only in Mexico, in the world, is we are moving from a world in which people would make a career and stay 40 years within a company to now there's a lot more rotation. So they have higher costs of finding the right talent. Then they don't have the right skills. So then they have to turn that around. So anything that can be done for them to decrease those costs of hiring, they are embracing it. And that's why they're embracing organizations like ours that are constantly thinking about what the labor force is demanding to incorporate it into what we're offering.
And what's the percentage success rate of your students finding jobs after graduating?
So for example, Juan, which is our university in the northern part of Mexico, has twice the industry average finding a job within the first 12 months. In education in Mexico, it's around 26%. Our students at Juan in a 12-month period, it's around 50%. And if you look at in all of Lotus, right, the number of Lotus graduates that earn more the industry average for our segment, we're at 56% versus 38%, right? So we are clearly outperforming, but not at the level that we aspire to be, right? We want this to be dramatically higher. And that's what one of our strategic bets for the next 5 years is how do we keep the focus in the ROI for our students, right? They are making a big bet on us. We want to make sure that there's a clear ROI for them, right? Especially if you look at what's happening in other geographies, like in the US, where because the cost of education have increased so much, ROI sometimes is not as clear. And there's with the increase in debt that many students in the US get, it's a problem. In Mexico, it's not, right? So in Mexico, you still have clear returns to an undergraduate degree. We are still generally affordable. But how do we think about generating an extra salary bump so that they can really switch the trajectory of their lifetime earnings? A lot of our students are first person in their family to ever go to college. If they have 5 to 10 dependents and we switch the lifetime earnings of them, you're talking, if we get to 200,000 students, about 1 million to 2 million Mexicans who could be better off. The potential for social impact is incredible.
Yeah, I guess that one of the challenges is reputational, that and your students will speak for what you're providing them when they go to work, and the employers see the benefits of hiring people from your universities. That's a long-term game, I guess, but it's very rewarding if it actually happens, no?
Oh, definitely. We cannot underestimate the value of the signal of the degree, right? We need employers, as you were saying, to recognize the value of somebody coming from one of our universities, right? And that's something we have been working on, but we will continue to work on.
Juan, thank you very much for joining us. Completely fascinating. Lots of luck with the strategic plan and with your new position at Lotus.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here with you both.
Thank you. Very interesting. We could keep on chatting for hours, but time is our constraint. Thank you again.
Well, thank you for joining Mex Moves. Hope you join us next week and subscribe to the podcast. Thank you, Eduardo.
Thank you, Damien. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Hope you tune in next week.